Hello, and welcome to this webinar on Teaching Shakespeare Online, hosted by Digital Theatre Plus. I'm Christy Carson, and the aim of today is to give you as much practical help as possible in terms of your own teaching. We're also going to try to give you a bit of an overview of the resources that are available and the creation process. I'm going to turn now over to our sponsor, Beatrice Lee from the Asian Shakespeare Association, who's going to welcome you and tell you a little bit about the upcoming conference that they're about to have.
Hello. On behalf of the Asian Shakespeare Association, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, Teaching Shakespeare Online. As we know, a side effect of the pandemic is that we get rejuvenated. No matter how many years or even decades you've been teaching, all of a sudden, it feels like you're back to graduate school, learning to teach for the first time. It is therefore important that we join force and brainstorm together, explore online resources, share strategies, and learn from each other. I'd like to thank Digital Theatre Plus for this excellent platform and Christy Carson, who organized these wonderful panels. May I also remind you that the ASA will hold its hybrid conference, Intersections in Shakespeare, in November. I hope to see you all there.
Thank you. The development of online resources for the study of Shakespeare in performance has been my aim for the past 20 years, beginning first with the digital edition of Shakespeare's play, which was focused on performance history. The Cambridge King Lear CD-ROM Text and Performance Archive was created as an example of the way that digital technology could help to illustrate the changing attitude towards editing and performance of Shakespeare's plays over time. The ability to trace trends in performance was also the central aim of my second digital project, Designing Shakespeare, an audiovisual archive. This project illustrated the way that the canon has been visualized for audiences in Stratford-upon-Avon and London over a 40-year period. The deep vertical approach of the CD, which looked at the one play over 400 years in the English-speaking world, was replaced in this project with a more horizontal view of the entire canon over a smaller geographic area, 2 cities in the United Kingdom. Over the past 2 decades, many colleagues have been working to bring digital resources that allow for the discussion of performance history into the classroom. Today's discussion will cover the approaches of a range of those colleagues who have generously come to join us today, and will highlight resources that are available to support anyone who wants to engage in this field. I will return to introduce each speaker and act as your master of ceremonies. And our discussion is going to begin with Digital Theatre's own resources for teaching Shakespeare and give you access to a wide range of full recordings of the plays and performance. We'll end the presentation with a demonstration of enhanced digital texts, which are available online for users worldwide at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. Between these 2 presentations, you'll hear from 3 pairs of colleagues who will discuss their teaching as well as their involvement in moving forward the debate about how to use digital technology to enhance classroom and online engagement. Therefore, we'll move from a wide overview to specific examples of teaching practice and resources that you can use in the classroom today. The recorded conversation will be made available through the Digital Theatre Plus website and the Asian Shakespeare website. If you've signed up, you will be given a link to the recording, and also the presentation slides will be made available. And at the end of the presentation, we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. So to begin with, I'm going to turn over to Talia Rogers of Digital Theatre Plus, who will provide an overview of the resources available on this wonderful site. When I first began working in the field, the aim was always to provide full video performances to every classroom in the world. Only recently has this been possible, and Talia will outline how these materials can be found and used in teaching. Talia.
Hi, Christy. Thank you very much. Right, well, hello everyone, and thanks for coming to this third webinar in our series about teaching drama and theatre online. I'm really excited about introducing you to the materials we have on Digital Theatre Plus relating to teaching Shakespeare, but I have to say it's no easy task. If you put Shakespeare into the Digital Theatre Plus search bar, you'll get nearly 400 results, many exclusive to Digital Theatre Plus, including several of our own original captures. That's hundreds of individual items of content about Shakespeare, including full productions, interviews with practitioners, masterclasses, study guides, documentaries, and so on. So to organise all of this, we've put together a Shakespeare catalogue separated into 5 sections. We have the plays, which is indicative materials we have for each play, grouped into comedies, tragedies, and histories. Theatre practice, with subsections including things like design, language, rehearsal, directing, and so on. Then there's cultural afterlife. Subsections are popular culture, adaptations, world Shakespeare. Performance and literary theory, which is materials relevant to post-colonialism, feminism, etc. And lastly, theatre history, Shakespeare's contemporaries in his world and context. So that's one way of navigating your way around this abundant content according to you or your students' particular area of interest. The catalogue is very much a work in progress, and we're adding to it all the time. We also have a forthcoming extensive written guide to using DT Plus Shakespeare content in the classroom, which also has some excellent discussion and teaching points in highlighted boxes. More news on that soon. Do let us know by email if you'd like us to send you that once it's finished. For now, though, what I thought I'd do is give you a deeper dive into the range of materials we have by taking a kind of case study approach and looking at just one play, Macbeth, as an example. The productions you can choose from, and they're all available to watch either in full or by act or by key scene, include Gregory Duran's production for the RSC in 2001, starring Anthony Sher and Harriet Walter, which is accompanied by interviews with both leads and the director about the production. There is also actually a separate long-form interview with Harriet Walter by Carol Rutter called Shakespeare's Women Today, in which she talks about this production in the context of feminism and gender politics. And like all our interviews, this is also chaptered, so you can jump straight to specific sections on things like gender blind casting or language or a particular play or whatever. Then there's our own DT capture of the Everyman production in 2011, starring David Morrissey and Julia Ford, directed by Gemma Bodinetz. This also has really illuminating extended analyses by the actors of the lead roles and their relationship and how to play that, plus an interview with the designer of the production, Francis O'Connor. And then we also have Tara Art's production directed by Jatinder Verma, created for the Black Theatre Live network, which features an all-Asian cast, Indian movement and music, and a very contemporary take on the play with 3 prophesying drag queens. Then there's Stratford Festival's production directed by Anthony Cimolino in 2016, and Rupert Gould's production for Chichester Festival in 2010, starring Patrick Stewart. So those are some key productions. There are others, including an audio production if you wanted to teach the text without the visuals, but those are the main ones I wanted to mention. And hopefully this gives you an idea of the range of materials we have on the site. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, some users will be excited about this amount of choice, but may not necessarily know where to start. So to address this, we've put together some very nifty compare and contrast selections. And these look at some key scenes and speeches, such as, for instance, Lady Macbeth's soliloquy, "The Raven himself is hoarse," and Act 2, Scene 1's "Is this a dagger I see before me?" And they show vividly, and in under 3 minutes in total, the very different interpretive approaches the actors and directors have taken in each case. And also how cultural representation can change over the decades, which is really fascinating. There are also, by the way, written guides to accompany these compare and contrast resources with lists of questions and tasks to give your students if you're looking for a primer. And then there are more eclectic and wide-ranging materials to steer your students towards, including a manga graphic novel of the play and reviews from the Stages archives of productions in the 1970s, including Peter Coe's pioneering all-black production at the Roundhouse in London. So that's what we have for just that one play. However, there are a few more key items from our Shakespeare collection which I feel compelled to mention to you, which are productions such as our DT capture of David Tennant's Much Ado About Nothing, directed by Josie Rourke, and English Touring Theatre's 2019 Othello, with accompanying interviews with many of the practitioners, but also essays on Elizabethan England and the Islamic world, and an intersectional analysis of Desdemona in the light of the Me Too movement, both by Jerry Broughton. We also have Deborah Warner and Fiona Shaw's Richard II. We have Tallow's all-black production of King Lear. We have the wonderful Donmar trilogy of all-female Julius Caesar, The Tempest, and Henry IV, with a wealth of accompanying interviews. It's really fascinating materials. And we have Stephen Berkoff's Coriolanus in the context of 1930s fascism. And then, last but very much not least, we also have some fascinating interviews with Shakespeare scholars such as Jonathan Bate, Michael Dobson, Peter Holbrook, Carol Rutter, our webinar colleague Abigail Rokison-Woodall, and Jyotsna Singh. A host of interviews with highly experienced practitioners, and a really excellent 12-part BBC documentary series, Shakespeare Uncovered, presented by an array of famous names from stage and screen who will be familiar to your students. So that's a very speedy run through of some of the materials we have to offer. You may be reeling from all of this, so if you have any questions about how to use DT Plus in the classroom, or you would like access to explore our exclusive content for yourself, do get in touch with us by emailing sales@digitaltheatre.com so you can explore with trial access. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Talia. You can tell that it's an amazing site, and there's an enormous amount to explore. We're now going to turn to Henry Bell from Sheffield Hallam University and Amy Borsuk from Queen Mary University. These two scholars approached me as a consulting editor in a recently published special edition of RIDE, Research and Drama Education, entitled Teaching Shakespeare, Digital Processes. This collection features case studies written by colleagues from across the globe, as well as theoretical articles and interviews with creators of digital resources, such as Robert Delamere, the founder of Digital Theatre. Working with Henry and with Amy, I was able, on this volume, allowed me to help to create an exciting collection that provides a snapshot of current teaching practice. They're going to give you an overview of what we found.
Great, thank you very much, Christy. Thanks, Talia, for creating this wonderful event. So before we get cracking on our presentation, I just thought it's worth Amy and I explaining who we are and our relation to digital Shakespeare. So I'm Henry, I'm a senior lecturer at Sheffield Hallam in performance, and prior to working full-time in academia, I worked in a variety of roles in the professional theatre industry, including, most relevant to this, a 4-year stint running the Shakespeare for Schools programme at the Orange Tree Theatre. Over this period, I worked with about 60,000 young people in a variety of contexts in London. But my experience of working with active methods makes me more of an advocate for digital Shakespeare than you might think. More of this a bit later. So in February, this themed issue of RIDE, Teaching Shakespeare Digital Processes, was published. I was a co-editor, and the other co-editor is my collaborator and partner in crime, Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Borsuk. I've just completed my PhD at Queen Mary University of London and have also just ended my time there as a teaching associate, being for the past 3 years or so. My dissertation and my research in general is a critical examination of the politics and ideologies behind staging what's considered radical Shakespeare, particularly during the 2010s. This included, for example, an in-depth exploration of the partnership between the Royal Shakespeare Company and the tech company Intel, and focusing on the wider picture of theater and the digital economy. Broadly, my research is interdisciplinary between Shakespeare theater studies, political economy, and digital humanities. So this RIDE issue was an ideal way to combine these interests with a pedagogical, methodological focus, and it was a very eye-opening experience, a very global one, and I have, of course, to thank both Christy and Henry for all of the amazing and hard work that they did throughout that process, and I'm going to turn it back over to Henry.
Great, cheers, Amy. So the general goal of this issue of RIDE was to capture the global state of digital strategies for teaching Shakespeare, including the technologies, the social contexts, the material and socio-economic limitations to these practices. So today, Amy and I would like to give you an overview of this content and serve as a good signpost for folks looking to work with digital Shakespeare materials in their teaching. And hopefully it'll give you a bit more information and confidence in working with materials outside of the English-speaking Anglo-American canon. So contained within the issue are articles, interviews, and case studies with teachers and practitioners in all of these locations in this slide, expertly put together by Amy. I'm not going to take credit for that. So we've got the UK, USA, Greece, Mauritius, South Africa, Canada, Cyprus, Singapore, China, Japan, and Turkey. So all three of us in the editorial team wanted the work represented in the journal to be heavily rooted in practice and on the ground issues. So it would be a useful resource for exactly the sorts of people who are here today beyond the immediate specifics of the applied theatre academic field. So over the next few minutes, Amy and I are going to highlight this work and broadly explore some of the issues around working with these digital Shakespeare processes, which we believe fit into two key clusters. Amy.
Yes. So yeah, our first sort of cluster of emerging themes that we noticed is evolving processes. So digital theater platforms, ebooks, apps, and media in the classroom. And a common theme within this topic of platforms and their use was the issue of how a platform or a tool's functionality heavily influences the pedagogical success of a digitally based activity. While this may feel obvious to anyone who has wrestled with confusing digital platforms, it is important to note the types of platforms and strategies which worked well, why they worked well, and what disparities there may be between the expectations for the platform and the reality. And many of our articles and the reports written by our authors address specific platforms and tools. In our interview with Robert Delamere, he spoke to us, for example, about his future visions for the Digital Theatre Plus platform in terms of its functionality and what kind of interactive work teachers could develop for their students. Although circumstances may have changed since the original interview in 2018, Delamere discussed his vision for DT Plus to become a site where students can create remixes of DT Plus materials. This marks a huge departure from other digital theater platforms such as Drama Online and Cambridge Shakespeare, which focus predominantly on text annotations, streaming productions, and guided textual and visual comprehension. In our issue, Noam Lior and Laura Turchi's ebook evaluations can help give teachers a sense of the breadth of scope and potential for ebooks tools in the classroom. Lior provides a helpfully thorough assessment of 7 ebook apps available at least in North America, evaluating their functionality and accessibility for teachers and students. Laura Turchi reports on the multiple ways that secondary school teachers in the US use the same app, Wordplay. Rick Marlatt discusses connected learning as an effective method for tapping into students' individual passions by constructing interactive spaces where personal interests and digital literacies drive participation. And Thomas Hamill's report documents his staging and filming assignment for which he wanted his students to use everyday digital technologies to make Shakespeare their own beyond the text, while also making him broadcastable to their peers and to the world in their own image. These apps are generally praised for their ability to get students involved in the text and performance at their own pace, which gives them a sense of empowerment in their own learning. And I'll turn it over to Henry for the other category that we wanted to talk about.
Great, thanks, Amy. So our second sort of cluster is decentering processes, working with and against the digital canon. And these were centered around the experiences of challenging canon and mainstream English-speaking work within a decolonized landscape. So luckily, we have the authors of the first article you can see on that slide representing themselves on the panel later today, and I'll leave them to discuss their perspective directly. Other areas that I'd like to just point you towards in the journal: Chris Thurman's candid account of teaching with BBC recorded work alongside more up-to-date local resources from the South African digital Shakespeare resource, shakespeare.za.org. It's a great site. Please do have a look at it. This provided a fascinating example of how long debated issues of authenticity and textual authority carry on into the digital landscape. This thread continued into Helena Hukumsingh and Shahim Uzarali's research article exploring their work in Mauritius and ultra-reflexive pedagogy. Now, again, there was a line here to navigate between bringing out the personal experiences and contemporary identity of the students in relation to Shakespeare's work, and the students' own expectations of what an authentic Shakespeare learning experience is entirely composed of. Now, there were also 2 case studies which particularly spoke to these issues in the journal. Anastasia Longathetti, working in Greece, discusses how digital platforms, including digital texts rather than streams or captures of performances, can help to challenge students' understanding of Shakespeare as existing in one single canonical text, or performances existing as conclusive, definitive iterations of a play text. Murat Oguchu's case study promoting student engagement in Turkish higher education is, I would say, a very important read for any teachers watching this who are working with learners with English as a second language. Now, finally, the editorial team's interview and my own response to former executive producer of Shakespeare's Globe, Tom Bird, highlights how the use of non-English speaking digital Shakespeare resources can emphasize the pluralities of interpretation. Now, my own work, documented in the interview article, reflects on a workshop I've delivered for English literature students in Sheffield. Here I used a video capture of the Belarus Free Theatre productions of King Lear, performed at the Globe to Globe Festival, to workshop interpretation ideas in response to a teacher request in relation to AQA's English Literature A-Level B assessments, in which learners must, and I quote directly from the exam board, explore different interpretations of set texts. So my practice as an applied theatre practitioner really brings together non-English speaking digital resources with people like Rex Gibson, pioneer of the active methods philosophy highlighted here. Now, in my mind, there is an ease with which new digital resources can synergize with people like Rex Gibson, working mostly in the pre-internet age and advocating active methods. And this synergy, bringing these 2 methods together, can really help students and imagine explore Shakespeare's. And I think Amy's just going to wrap things up now for us.
Yes, and so to conclude, the sort of final concept and an overarching problem that came up across all of these different case studies, reports, and articles is that digital Shakespeare processes and current platform implementations are limited by gaps in teachers and students' digital skills. And COVID-19 since has really made visible that digital access is divided along economic, geographical, and racial lines. Digital pedagogies must therefore be adaptable to these varied socioeconomic contexts and be applicable at both a global institutional scale and a local one. This accessibility is not the responsibility of a single teacher, student, or platform, but of globally networked governing bodies. And thank you very much. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Amy.
Henry and Amy, for a wonderful overview of global activity in the classroom, but also of some online resources that people might not otherwise know anything about. Our second conversation is featuring Erin Sullivan and Abigail Rokison-Woodall, both of the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon, discussing their experiences of teaching an international cohort of students online. And some people may not know this, but they have been doing this for almost, Erin in particular, a decade. So it's one of the longest standing online courses available. They'll discuss a range of the online provision offered by the Shakespeare Institute, both before, during, and after the pandemic, which enables collaborative learning for students across the globe. So over to Erin and Abigail.
Great. Thank you so much, Christy, for organizing. So like Christy said, I'm Dr. Erin Sullivan. I'm a member of academic staff at the Shakespeare Institute, as is my colleague, Dr. Abigail Rokison-Woodall. And we're going to be telling you a little bit about the work that we've done teaching online at the Institute, both past and present. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of an introduction to what we have done, and then Abigail is going to talk about what we're now doing in response to the global context that we're all dealing with this year. So like Christy said, for over a decade, we've had distance learning or offsite learning MAs at the Shakespeare Institute. We're based in Stratford-upon-Avon. We're part of the University of Birmingham in the UK. But through these distance courses, we have students all over the world, which has been a huge benefit to us, hopefully to our students as well, in terms of broadening out the study of Shakespeare at the MA level and enriching our own understanding of Shakespeare's global sort of engagement and ramifications. The two MAs that we teach by distance learning are an MA in Shakespeare and Theatre, which can be studied entirely online, and the other one is MA Shakespeare and Education, which is entirely online, save one course, although this year it went digital as well, and Abigail will say a bit more about that. We do have quite a blended approach to teaching at the Shakespeare Institute. So another joy of our programs is being able to see students for certain modules in person and then certain ones online. And that might be something that you all as teachers are working with, a kind of blended or hybrid mode where you might have students that you're seeing in person for a week or for a certain amount of time and then who become remote. And it does pose challenges in terms of adapting to that movement back and forth. But hopefully you're also finding, like us, that it can be really interesting because you get the chance to work with students in different ways and see how different contexts, the online and the in-person, open up various possibilities. So Christy asked me to say a little bit about what I feel like we needed to get our distance learning programs going at the Institute. The first thing we really needed, especially because we teach at the MA level, was a really good library of electronic resources. So things like digital theater, platforms that offer access to high quality performance recordings are really crucial, as well as academic publishers over the last 10 years really making more and more of their offerings available electronically, both books that are currently being published, but also ones that have been published in the past. We also have needed a really robust virtual learning environment or platform. So the digital classroom that we're in, and I think you all, whatever kind of classroom or group of students you're teaching, are probably finding that it's not that different from the physical space you're in. If you're teaching in person is so important, the digital space you're in is equally important if you're teaching online. And we've also needed access to some recording equipment, although not quite as fancy as some people might expect. And that brings me to the last thing I was going to mention before I turn over to Abigail, is that when people ask what has been the most important tool or approach or pedagogical principle for me when it comes to teaching online, I actually think for me it's been sort of maybe deceptively simple, in that finding ways to really feel present, really feel like I'm talking to someone on the other end of the computer, even though I might be sitting downstairs in a room by myself talking. I do imagine that I'm talking to someone else and trying to cut out all of the other noise around me, having email off, having other things not there, so that you can try to focus and really speak to your students, even though it's in a different context. And equally being prepared to be as responsive as possible. And I do find that I end up putting more time into out-of-class communications with students when I'm teaching them in the online context. So I'll turn over to Abigail.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, I'm Dr. Abigail Rokison-Woodall, also from the Shakespeare Institute. I convene the MAs in Shakespeare in Education, Shakespeare in Theatre, and Shakespeare in Creativity. So I'm involved in lectures and seminars, but also quite a lot of practical work. So like Erin, I've been involved in the past in distance learning courses, but these have been mainly fairly traditional academic modules involving students who've chosen to study via distance learning. However, this April just gone, I was supposed to be running a pedagogy module with the RSC, and that was supposed to be a on-site 6-day intensive course with participation from a range of theatre and education practitioners. Students were supposed to be taking part in regular discussion, but also practical workshops. So when this suddenly had to go online due to COVID, it did seem quite a challenge. But we did soon find that the technology enabled us to run the module. We had to run it over a longer period of time, but we could run it without losing core elements. So So the RSC searched its resources, found some films of their work with schools. We got people to film interviews. Some of the brilliant companies who work with Shakespeare and young people, including Kelly Hunter and Flute Theatre, Intermission Youth Theatre, the Coram Shakespeare Schools Foundation, they were all really willing to record videos on Zoom so that our students could have sort of virtual workshops with them. And we recorded lectures on Zoom. We divided all of these resources into kind of weekly sessions and then had a Zoom seminar at the end of the week. I did find that running Zoom seminars takes some getting used to. It's difficult, or it can be difficult, to get discussion going because it's quite hard for somebody to interject. We found that one of the best things was for everybody to keep themselves muted and unmute in order to make a contribution. There is, I think, a positive side to this, which was that everybody was therefore invited at various points in the seminar to contribute their ideas. And it did mean there was less chance of one or two people dominating the conversation and others remaining quiet. So as we move into the new academic year, the big challenge has been working out how to do practical work on Zoom. And I've taken part in various workshops and classes. It can be hard to get a sense of ensemble on a Zoom call. And there is perhaps the disadvantage that students can't watch each other working. But I'm trying to also, and I genuinely have also seen this as a positive. I think that in practical classes, sometimes students who aren't natural performers, or used to doing physical theatre or voice work, can feel quite self-conscious. So I often do exercises with students where I ask them to work independently, for example, using love and effort actions, and then add in the Shakespeare text when they feel they've gained a sort of appropriate level of intensity. And often nobody wants to be the person to start. And it's not until one brave student begins to speak aloud that all the others start to join in. I also find that in voice workshops, some students do all the work slightly under voice because they're worried their voice is going to be the loudest, it's going to stick out. And I think Zoom does have the potential to get rid of much of this self-consciousness. You can give students, for example, a lab and effort action to explore, and then invite them, if they choose, to turn off their cameras or microphones and work in the privacy of their own room. So they can hold themselves around confident that nobody can see them. And I think they can feel empowered to maybe truly experiment and take risks in a way that, of course, we always try to encourage in a workshop setting, but in reality, some students find difficult. I think particularly with some of our MA students, there's always a feeling that you want to get something right. So I hope that as and when classes have to take place on Zoom, it is going to encourage more risk-taking, a bit more true experimentation with voice and physicality, and less concern from students comparing themselves to one another. I think my main takeaway about, or what I'm going to try to focus on this term, is to sort of embrace the differences in online rather than on-site teaching, rather than simply trying to replicate exactly what I would do in a on-site setting online. And I'll be happy to talk a bit more about that in questions. Thank you.
Great. And just for me to conclude, in terms of if I had to offer one tip, Christy asked us to finish with that, would really be just to try to be yourself, to try to be present. And like Abigail said, recognize that there are going to be differences, but they're not insurmountable, and you don't have to perform a different kind of identity because it's on screen. And also, I suppose, to be prepared to help do maybe a little bit more or slightly different hand-holding with students than you used to, because they don't have those opportunities to just grab you in the hall or something like that.
Thanks so much to both of you. Hopefully the viewers will begin to see what an extraordinary panel that I've been able to assemble here, who have experiences not just in teaching, but also in acting and directing, and in the case of our last two presenters, in archive creation as well. So we're going to turn finally to, in terms of the pairs of colleagues talking about teaching, Yong Lan and Roweena. And they're going to talk about their experiences in developing a course that came out of the ASAI database that they were deeply involved in creating. So I've been discussing digital technology and how it can enhance the study of performance, Shakespeare performance, for many years now with Leland. And I think our first conversation was about the challenges of creating a transcript of the performance for the database in 4 different languages, and the opportunities that this then presents to shift the focus from a purely Western view of Shakespearean performance. So over to the 2 of you.
I teach and research Shakespeare at the National University of Singapore from a position outside the centres of Europe-American production. That is at a point along the circuits for his work. I lead the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive, which collects, translates, and creates data for East and Southeast Asian Shakespeare performance materials. The current edition of the archive has 62 productions in 17 languages. The archive has a parallel language interface that's fully equivalent in 4 languages: English, Japanese, and Korean. The scripts are time-coded to full-length video recordings, and the editors prepare detailed data on the event, on the art forms that the production uses, its reception, and the cultural context, also in 4 languages.
I'm a PhD candidate in theatre studies, also at the National University of Singapore. Before moving to Singapore, I completed my BA and MA in English Literature, both at the University of Edinburgh. My research interests lie at the intersections of gender performance and Asian Shakespeares. I've been teaching a module on Shakespeare and Asian performances with Dr. Yong for 4 years now. I also supervise students doing the undergraduate research module with the ASA, with a focus on the sub-editorial of multilingual scripts and English language editorial.
Next slide, please. Next one. Next one.
Yes, next one, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Today we'll speak on teaching Shakespeare performance in our region using the archived performances in ASIA. There are 2 primary contexts that I think we need to consider from this position. First, unlike Anglophone contexts in which Shakespeare's texts present an older form of language, here they are distant both in time and in place. In other words, they are linguistically and culturally remote to our students. 2, the plays also have a different past, so they're not just older, their past is different from Anglophone contexts. This past is tied to the legacy of British colonialism and Western imperialism that brought Shakespeare along with modernization.
So in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've actually moved from embodied teaching in the classroom, which we wrote about in our article, to teaching online using the Zoom platform. This shift from the physical classroom to online teaching actually parallels the shift from the live performance event to the archived video recording. On the one hand, we might say that online teaching and the mediatization of live performances both entail the loss of an embodied collective event, as co-presence is replaced by the mediation of the screen. However, conditions for classroom teaching are always already altered through the digital medium. In our particular case, because the module was always based on the use of ASIA. Teaching online with the archive, therefore, is in many ways an extension of teaching in the classroom, and is actually producing new modalities for teaching and studying Asian Shakespeares. Also, the screen distance
Next slide, please.
Also, the screen distance unsettles the hierarchies embedded in embodiment. And there are actually 3 forms of hierarchies I'd like to talk about. First one is the hierarchy of blocking. Here I'm referring to the blocking in the classroom, where conventionally the teacher is usually at the front of the class. Instead, the Zoom layout actually performs the decentering of the teacher's authority, since now our screens are spread out laterally across the computer window. The gap between the live and the archive performance similarly situates the reader with more autonomy because they're inhabiting their own space and time. The second hierarchy is the hierarchy of knowledge. So in the classroom, the student is expected to already embody knowledge. And in fact, looking things up online displaces the conversation and is quite disruptive to face-to-face conversation. But if we all move to the screen now, the Google search becomes another screen that can, in fact, more easily enter into the conversation. The third hierarchy is the hierarchy of the English language in performances in the ex-British colonies. So here we're talking about the performance and reading of Shakespeare in English, which we may understand to be authentic, but actually poses a problem for performances in the ex-British colonies. For example, do we perform in local English or another language? Basically, then English no longer has the same status once it is placed alongside other languages in the archive.
Go back to the previous slide, please. That's right, thank you. ASA is born digital, multimedia, multilingual, is a vital resource for teaching. It also offers an alternative way of relating to Shakespeare and Asian performance. ASIA provides the infrastructure and the principles for connecting and working together online. It's also free. I'll say a few things now quickly, run through a few points on how I think ASIA is infrastructural to how we think about relating to performance in Asian languages and cultures and relating on the screen. Firstly, it employs the interrelationships of multiple screens. Roweena's already spoken about it, so I'll say no more now. Secondly, it levels the playing field of English among East Asian languages. The interface creates relationality between English and other languages, between the languages of performance and the languages of translation. So it displaces the binary between Shakespeare's English and local English, between original and foreign Shakespeare. It puts Shakespeare in local Englishes into conversation with other performance contexts in the region. In short, it allows us to move away from the notion of original Shakespeare at the center and the rest of us like spokes on a wheel around it. Third, it enables detailed comparative study. ASA was designed and intended to facilitate the kind of close analysis and study that's not possible if you watch performances quite disparate in time and place. And last, it bridges the gap between the live and the archived event with information in the data. It helps. We know that attending a performance is quite different from writing and talking about it. And the data helps students think about the discursive terms in which we discuss performance and how those terms are different in different languages as well.
Next slide, please. Thank you. So one practical example of bridging these gaps is when students learn to work with a parallel multilingual script in the format of a Microsoft Word document. So the Word document then actually becomes a medium through which we begin to analyze the relationship between the languages and between script and performance. So last year, I supervised a student who edited the Malay language script and English subtitles for Datuk Sri. It's a Malaysian adaptation of Macbeth by the Actors Studio. Now in this production, we note that the Fleon's characters performed in ways that are gender ambiguous. The student noticed that the Malay word for child, anak, does not distinguish between gender. And this actually reflects the ambiguity that we're watching on stage. However, she also pointed out that the English subtitles provided by the theatre company use the word daughter, which actually then serves to linguistically gender the character. Now, she could only have seen these distinctions through looking at the languages in relation to one another in the document. And our whole discussion about this issue took place through notes we left each other in the margins of the script. And this is actually a broader reflection of how the ASIA community works.
Let me conclude with a second example of how the teaching fosters interaction in similar ways to how the ASIA team work. We interact through online software and files, through a Google Doc, through video, through data maps, and we work in different time zones, so that's necessary as well. Interestingly, we found that the students feel less tied to what they have written because they come to class having made answers that they have to do before class, and then they are read out during class. And the screen interaction alters the fixity of the words on the page. From the last 2 weeks, I found that students upload answers in the module and responses to each other, but then they asked for the first time to change the document as we worked on it in the middle of the seminar. Because I think my understanding is that the interaction class with the document has altered. So the document now has a different status in relation to the class conversation. Instead of the document remaining as it was when they entered the classroom, they wanted to dynamically alter and to use the interaction, our interaction on screen, to alter the document and have it more closely reflect the progress and the cumulative knowledge created through the seminar. Conversely, they also like to contribute to ASIA. They ask to change the data, for instance, when they notice that we can't identify a song, and they have done so. So in short, the online medium can also be a way in which communities in different languages actually interact through the screen. That's all from us today. Thank you very much. We are happy to answer questions a bit later.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And what you've really started to hit on is the advantages of the screen as well as the disadvantages, the way that it enables a working between different languages, both technical languages and linguistic languages. And I think the other thing that you're starting to discuss is the idea of the born digital. And so our final presenter is Janelle Jenstad, who's going to talk about a new resource, the Linked Early Modern Drama Online. And what it does is bring together some of the earliest experimentations with online born digital editions of the plays, with the internet Shakespeare editions, which some people may already be familiar with, and bringing that together with new and just about to be created editions of the plays from a wider canon. So placing Shakespeare within the Renaissance drama a bit more broadly. So what this final presentation does is bring together the idea of performance history with the idea of textual history, which is what I have been trying to do since that first CD-ROM. So I'm going to turn over to Janelle, and she'll give you an example of what is about to be available from the University of Victoria.
Thank you very much, Christy. Thank you. Can you hear me? I teach in an English department at the University of Victoria, but most of my time I work with large teams of students to build large-scale editorial projects. So we're the team that brought you the map of early modern London, which has been around for 21 years now, and now we're turning our attention to a major editorial platform for early modern drama. Online teaching, as we've all discovered, requires reliable editions and web resources for students who may be anywhere in the world. It's been our experience at UVic this term on the far west coast of North America that many of our students have stayed home, wherever home is, and they're often in locations where textbook delivery is simply not feasible. I'd like to introduce you today then to a new open access project that aims to make the plays of Shakespeare and his contemporaries available around the world to anyone with an electronic device and an internet connection. We began working on this project long before the pandemic, but we now see that it will have additional value to our teaching colleagues. Linked Early Modern Drama Online, or LEMDO, is a new platform for editors to prepare and encode critical editions of plays using the markup language of the Text Encoding Initiative. Next slide, please. The LEMDO platform replaces and supersedes the ISE platform. You may already know of the Internet Shakespeare editions. LEMDO is the new home for that important project, as well as for the digital Renaissance editions. Next slide, please. And the Queen's Men editions. The LEMDO team in Victoria is remediating the ISE editions, supporting editors as they make the transition to this new platform, and publishing new projects such as the John Day Anthology and the Moemel Mayoral Shows Anthology. Alas, the old ISE platform is no longer technologically viable. Those of you who rely on the resources that were published on the DRE, ISE, and QME projects will be glad to know that my developer colleagues were able to take digital snapshots of the 3 websites before the server failed. Preserving 1.5 million web pages is not easy, and the results are not perfect. But while we're building LEMDO, you can still work with most of the resources that you've come to love. Next slide, please. The basic structure of a LEMDO edition is similar to that of an ISE edition with some new features. What we're looking at here is a side-by-side view of the ISE and the LEMDO editions of Henry V, edited by James Murdoch. You can see a screen capture of the ISE edition landing page on the left, and on the right is the wireframe of the LEMDO edition landing page. We haven't finished working on the interface yet, but you can see that we've maintained the same basic structure. Next slide, please. Every edition begins with semi-diplomatic transcriptions of the early witnesses, in this case, the quarto and folio texts of Henry V. Next slide. These are linked to open access color scans so that you can show your students what the quarto looked like. It's always a hit in the classroom. James has also prepared modern spelling text of both witnesses, so you can have your students dip into the quarto and discover for themselves that the chorus, scene 1, and the beginning of what we now know as Act 2 or Scene 2 are missing. The modern texts have multiple annotation and collation tracks, glosses to help students understand the meaning of words, commentary notes to guide the student and the teacher through the scholarly conversation, textual notes for the advanced student, lexical notes for those who are interested in the development and meaning of words and phrases, performance notes on particular performances, and pedagogical notes for teachers and professors with teaching tips, links to resources, and ideas for classroom exercises. These latter are not necessarily prepared by the editor of the text. They might be prepared by a gifted teacher later on, and that gives us the capacity to ensure that the teaching materials are always addressing current contexts and our latest theories and practices for teaching. Could you go back to slide 20, please? Each edition also includes critical paratexts and performance resources, a general introduction, a textual essay, surveys of performance and critical history, sources, analogs, and other early texts for teachers who wish to teach Shakespeare contextually, other explanatory materials like family trees, and production videos and other materials from performance as research exercises. No print edition can offer all of these options, and indeed, even in the online environment, no one teacher would avail herself of all of these materials, but the editions have the virtue that they can be used by learners at different levels and by teachers with different approaches, historical, textual, and performance-oriented. With a broad user group in mind, we're designing interfaces for high school students who need glosses, to scholars who need XML transcriptions, to theater practitioners who need scripts. Can we go to slide 23, please? A key feature of the LEMDO platform is the ability to pair Shakespeare's plays with those of his contemporaries. The QME edition of the famous Victories of Henry V is also published on the LEMDO platform. It's edited to the same high standards as Shakespeare's Henry V, with links between the 2 editions. Once we've launched the suite of LEMDO sites this fall, DRE, ISE, QME, and the LEMDO Anthology of the Whole, we'll turn our attention to creating a custom course pack builder and to supporting new editors. Our goal is lofty: to support a large team of editors as they edit hundreds of plays in the next 15 years, and to ensure that those digital editions are maximally useful in a broad range of teaching and learning contexts. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Janelle. We're now going to, I'm just going to finish off by expressing my thanks to everyone, and I hope that this journey through the past 2 decades of digital development will have revealed is that scholars have been working on these questions for a long time, both across time zones and across language barriers, to make the study of Shakespeare in the classroom an experience that is supported by a wealth of creative resources. So you can see that this is not a new topic of conversation for any of us, but it is one which inspires us to move forward with the aim of extending the once quite closed international collaborative conversation to the widest possible audience. So, drawing on the expertise of our entire panel, I'm now going to turn to some questions. We have questions from that have been posted in advance, but if anyone wants to add questions into the chat box, this would be the moment to do it. So I'm going to start with Janelle, and I'm going to ask her about the model that has been used for LEMDO, which is to make sure that the resources are available free online. And I just wanted to ask her about that policy, but also about other resources that she could recommend, perhaps, in terms of freely available resources. You're muted, Janelle.
We have a very deep, longstanding commitment to open access resources at the University of Victoria, and I'm very fortunate to have base-funded support from the library and also from a Humanities Computing and Media Center. We've been very successful in getting grants from our national granting agency, and we do get donations from time to time. So that's how we've been able to do it. And my time, of course, is free because it's part of my research activities. All the content is generated by editors who want their content to be generated. So it's so far it's working. We haven't run out of money or time or expertise yet. A couple of projects that I really like are the Folger Shakespeare texts. I've used them very successfully with middle school students, as well as with my own students at the university. The Richard Broom online project is quite fun. And of course, the digital anthology of early modern English drama. Another new project on the horizon is the Shakespeare Census project, designed by Zach Lesser and Adam Hooks, I believe. And it has links to Quarto texts and libraries all around the world. And that's a really wonderful resource for showing students what these books actually look like. You can get them out of EBO and into this free environment.
Great, thank you so much. And I think in addition to the resources that we're going to be discussing, you can see on the screen at the moment there is a list of articles by the panelists and some recommended reading, so that hopefully that you'll have access to absolutely everything that we've been talking about. I'm going to turn now to Henry and to Abigail, because quite a few of the questions that actually were posed before we began were about acting and doing practical exercises through this online environment. And so I'm just going to turn to Henry first to ask about your own experiences in this area.
Yeah, I mean, it's the big question, isn't it? So I work at Sheffield Hallam. We had a double credit performance module final year, which is usually a festival, and that had to change very quickly. So we had a whole bunch of students who had to suddenly work in their own homes, in their own rooms, with all the challenges that brings. And a lot of the questions that come up are about, well, how do you actually work practically when you've got people in a bedroom? And also there's various issues with socioeconomic factors, that the demographic of students that I tend to teach at post-92 university like Sheffield Hallam are sharing family homes, don't necessarily have a fantastic internet connection. Anyway, let's not be too negative about it. The final result was absolutely fantastic, and I was incredibly impressed with the resilience of the students and the creativity of the students, and particularly how they could approach Shakespeare's text from quite a decentered perspective, like working out how they can really bring it into their own voice. For me, the number one tip for working practically is to make the most out of the site that the students are using and let that speak to their response to Shakespeare's work. So if we're particularly thinking about production work here, so it was really interesting seeing how the students responded to their homes for some of the locations of Shakespeare's work, particularly Macbeth is very, very interesting in terms of people moving between bedrooms. I'm thinking particularly about the sort of end of Act 1 and beginning of Act 2 there. There was some really excellent work being done there. And I've recently done some, I've done a review for Shakespeare Bulletin about a project on shakespeare.za.org, which I think really speaks to this. It's called Lockdown Shakespeare, and it's in fact, I can just share my screen so you can have a quick look at it. I can't share my screen, but that's fine.
Well, you can put it into the chat a bit later. But yeah, exactly. Again, I think what's really exciting is the idea that the students are not seeing this as necessarily just a restriction, but taking the opportunity to really run with those changes and those challenges. And I think our attitude is looking at the limitations. Whereas if you allow the students to have that opportunity to be optimistic, sometimes they bring things to the classroom that they might not have otherwise, and you might not have got that opportunity. I'm going to turn over to Abigail to give a sense of her response to this.
Yeah, I mean, I've already said a little bit about it in terms of some of the strengths I think there are of working with Zoom. And I think, I mean, actually, one of the things I'm realizing is that chat rooms are actually the chat room facility on something like Zoom is a really good thing for students to work on, scenes in pairs. And actually is looking at the moment like it's going to be slightly more practical than students in a room with masks on 2 meters apart from one another trying to do that. So, yeah, there are the strengths. I think also, I mean, it's difficult to say too much about what I'm going to do this year until I've told the students. But one of the things that I'm thinking is if students are working on Shakespeare monologues or writing their own monologues or whatever or short scenes, that actually we can embrace, for example, talking about the difference between Shakespeare on film or Shakespeare on screen, Shakespeare on television, acting for screen as opposed to acting for stage. I'm going to maybe use some of the talking heads, some of the lockdown performances that have been being done in order to kind of model that for students. And yeah, we are going to be thinking about creating with the RSC certainly some quite decent online performances, and again, another advantage is the size of the audience you can reach that way. You can reach a lot more audience members by producing a kind of decent online piece than you can performing, wherever it might be in a kind of small studio space. So.
Absolutely. And I think, as you say, some really creative things have come out of both, the things that have been sponsored by the British Council and the BBC, and those are models that students can use, but then, using their own creativity and whatever they have available to them. I'm just going to bring Talia in here, if possible, so that she can tell you about the fact that, in fact, the last 2 of these webinars have been focused specifically on issues of acting and performance.
Yes, thank you, Christy. The first webinar that we did was called Digital Learning Solutions for Teaching Theatre Online, and that had 2 presenters from the US and 2 presenters from the UK, and we chose them because they were all pioneers in teaching theatre online, and they'd been doing it for a long time. That was rather wonderful. They were presenting ideas and best practices and inspiration and so on, and then. And out of that came a lot of requests for specifically a webinar on teaching voice, acting and movement online. So we had, again, another panel of presenters, one from Central School of Speech and Drama, and then 3 more in California. All of those, both of those recordings are available. So we're really happy to give them, give access to as many people as possible, because they're really full of useful information and ideas. So we can send them out with the recording of this webinar after this event.
Yeah, great. Okay, we're going to move on. We're running out of time a little bit, and so please do feel free to add in your questions at the moment if you can, but otherwise we can answer questions after the fact as well. I'm going to turn to Leland and to Roweena because I want to think about this idea of diversity and including other perspectives. I think that the AISA database is predicated on the idea of making flattening some of the hierarchies that you were talking about, and I want to ask you what you think about how other ways of achieving that kind of challenge to Western dominance of Shakespeare in performance, why it's important.
As it'd be easy to see that I've been educated entirely in English all my life. And so I expected myself, as my students now learning Shakespeare in school are all expected to adopt and kind of replicate, as it were, an English student's understanding of Shakespeare. But I was an undergraduate at Oxford, I realized it's different for me from my guests, because it's not my history. I don't relate to it in the same way. And it was only when I returned to Singapore and I was teaching and I watched performances here that I started to really appreciate the ways in which we interact with Shakespeare. And so I think it's important simply for diversity, for an understanding of how different people and different cultures with different histories for Shakespeare relate differently. And that's the same whether you're in a post-colonial environment like me or whether you're not and you're an English student. It's still important to understand how the relationship with Shakespeare is differentiated across the world.
Yeah. And Roweena, well, how do you feel in terms of the students that you're teaching? Is there an awareness of that colonial history that you feel you're fighting against?
Well, I think so, because Shakespeare is still a very foundational part of their secondary school education, and so very often they are taught in certain ways, and by the time they come to us and take the module, I think we can see certain tendencies. So for example, to maybe place primacy on Shakespeare as a literary text and maybe not focus so much on performance. So I think we are seeing those tendencies, and so very often at the start of our module we have to undo a lot of prior assumptions that the students bring with them to the classroom. So a lot of that is an unmaking as much as it is a remaking.
But they do tell us that it's the very first time that they've ever been able to sort of study Shakespeare from their own point of view, culturally.
And I think that that's an interesting observation that I would make as well, being Canadian, studying and teaching here in the UK, is the fact that actually my students towards, more recently, I've had to explain colonialism to them, of a sense of that dominance of the UK in their upbringing. But there's a question there from Brooke, who's asking about Shakespeare adaptation and regional interpretations compared with Elizabethan, original practices question, that idea. In the database that you have put together, is there any attempt are most of them modern dress, or are there some that have attempted to do an Elizabethan, either an English Elizabethan approach or an Asian period approach?
There's a lot of Asian period approach, a lot, because it's often they use a parallel from myth, legend, and so quite a bit of it is set in the past, actually. But there is also, interestingly, the history of Shakespeare in Asian countries. It used to be performed in a kind of English style and using, not Elizabethan exactly, but a kind of old-fashioned English dress, as it were, Western dress. And sometimes these days that is actually parodied in more localized versions. So For instance, Ping Fong Shamlet, where it's a Taiwanese theater company putting on an old style traditional Western dress realist performance in the way that Asian performances of Shakespeare used to imitate and copy Western productions in the earlier part of the 20th century. So this company is actually putting it on, and then they fail. I mean, it's a kind of quite a poor attempt to do it. And so the whole play is about a local company putting on old-fashioned Western dress realist performance.
And I think that there's a whole genre almost, isn't there, of putting on a play as being a sort of metaphor for the things that happen within the play. There's certain a number of films that sort of follow that model. But also, I think the other thing that's interesting about looking at a historic version of a Shakespeare play in another language is that then you have to deal with the questions of changing language and changing social and economic environments over time. And in the Globe to Globe Festival that I attended all of, there was an interesting way in which the plays were used to say quite knowing things about that colonial past as well. Do you have other examples of that kind of making and remaking? Is the question that's being asked. Some approaches on how to encourage students to approach Shakespeare text towards adapting them to something more culturally relevant. Do you have some thoughts about that?
We have plenty, and very often they use, like, say, a local theatre genre. We are working right now on editions. In the current iteration of ASIA, we're working on editions which will do annotation and put them together within a theme. Like, one of our themes is spirits. And the very first production we worked on was the first we collected for the archive, called by a theatre company, Kunaoka Theatre Company. And it's set on Cyprus, but it's a kind of adaptation of a No performance. So it's in Japanese, and it's an adaptation of a No performance that centers on the unquiet spirit of Desdemona, who is met by a pilgrim. So it follows, in some respects, the structure of a No performance, but it brings in some translation of Shakespeare. So it has different parts. Some is more like no dialogue with a chorus and chanting, and there's dance as well. But then there's some aspects that are translated from Shakespeare, some scenes. They even have the ghost of Desdemona watching Othello and Iago in scenes that she did not originally witness in Shakespeare's play. So the play within a play can be used, is very often used as a means of doing that, for adapting Shakespeare to a regional context. It's not so much, it's cultural context, but it's specifically also to do with theatre forms like No, which specifically bring spirits on stage.
Well, and the plays are full of those sort of meta theatrical moments where there's the opportunity to talk about means of communication through the way that the play within the play is created, or the interaction with the actors. I'm going to move on just to Erin and Amy, because we're running out of time. Thank you very much, both Leland and Roweena. And I want to think about technologies, both in the theatre and, yes, if we can bring everybody in, that would be even better. Perfect. Technologies that are being used increasingly in the theatre, but also then whether or not some of those new technologies can be used in the classroom. And again, we're thinking about the restrictions, but also the freedoms that having all of these things available to us might provide. So if I start with you, Erin, what sort of technologies have you been encouraging your students to explore?
Yeah, so I personally don't teach practical drama, so I don't have experience with that. But in terms of teaching Shakespeare, in sort of looking at performance of Shakespeare, also reading Shakespeare and discussing, it sounds old-fashioned, but I really try to focus in all of my classroom design, including online, on what I want the students to learn, what I want them to be able to do with Shakespeare or through Shakespeare through this class, and then think about the technologies I need to enable that. Because I think this is, as people become more and more immersed in digital culture, this is becoming less controversial. But when I first started, I really encountered a lot of people who said, we have to have this tool first and then we can do this, or I'm going to build a class around this tool. And I found that didn't work. And also it didn't work for me, but it also often made people feel like they couldn't do something if they didn't didn't subscribe to this platform or something like that. Of course, it means that it doesn't mean that everything is possible. You have to think about what it is you want your students to learn and then to move forward with it. But I would also say then, when I'm thinking about what technologies I'm using, the best ones I use are the ones that don't feel that fancy or that foreign to students. So, things that have already become fairly mainstreamed. I try to keep the design that I use in virtual learning platforms as simple and as streamlined as possible, because I find it's very easy for students to get lost in little rabbit holes, even within a class, never mind once you set them onto some platform and they start digging and getting swirled around. So I suppose I get quite a very strong sense of structure within your platform, I think, can be really helpful. And then having moments where I do a lot of activities where I give students choice, where they can go and find something, whether it's a reading or a viewing that they bring back. So I try to have that agency available for students, but in a quite directed way, because I do think you have to sort of, to use pedagogical language, just scaffold these things carefully, one step at a time. But all of that is really similar to what I do in a physical classroom as well. So I would say, again, we have had to have had to be able to record material, but there are lots of different open access things you can use to record things. I mean, now everyone's using Zoom or some kind of webinar service. We've been using those for years as optional opportunities for our distance learning students. But I have to say that I think now there's going to be much more take up, because they've all of a sudden become culturally mainstreamed. And that's the thing that I think is crucial in a classroom context, is for something to feel accessible and not like a kind of, really esoteric technology that actually can be really intimidating for a lot of students.
Yeah. I'll ask you, Amy, if you've come across in your teaching anything that you would recommend or found useful in terms of new technologies.
Well, with the caveat that unfortunately I've been made redundant as an early career researcher, so I won't be able to. I don't have a class to speak of currently, especially for Shakespeare. But I can speak to the moment that all of the classes had to go online in March, because I was teaching a second year module, which was on contemporary London theatre. And the whole point of the module was to go see shows in London in different urban contexts at different scales, and talk about the relationship between sight and meaning. And shifting to a digital format for that required a plurality of medium, basically, by which I mean using blog posts and forums, as well as live like webinar context. So offering a variety of points of entry for the students. And a lot of this was because the majority of my students in that class were international study abroad students who had to be whisked off home really quickly. So having a variety of options for engagement was essential, because some were able to attend the remaining live webinars, but many of them were still asleep just by nature of it was impossible to incorporate everybody. So having the blog posts and the forums made sure it guaranteed that everyone was able to contribute in some way. So just offering that variety has been essential. And as for specific technologies, I think what I have noticed, and again, especially in that moment where I need to gather some resources for shifting to predominantly online, the key thing is honestly the shift of these already existing platforms and these already existing resources to be open to the public. The fact that out of necessity, globally, teachers at different levels were all having to turn to each other to ask, how are you doing this? And this is obviously still happening. That is the point of this webinar, to have that conversation and to share and to create shared resources has just been absolutely critical in my own pedagogical learning and my own sort of cobbling and hoarding of resources and ideas and practices. So to list, I guess, a few specific resources that I used, particularly in the more frantic moments. There's actually a Google Doc, which is open to the public, and it's called Teaching Theater Online, A Shift in Pedagogy. And it addresses technical aspects of teaching theater online, as well as seminars and critical theory. And it's encouraged to be a global contribution. There tends to be a North American bias. I'm trying to add some UK stuff, but we need beyond the Anglo-American world as well. And the ATH, the Association for Theater and Higher Education, has a webpage for resources for teaching online. HowlRound is another great website that has always been talking about pedagogy and theater in particular. And I believe those are the biggest examples that I had that I wanted to speak about. But overall, the whole goal really is to encourage and facilitate collaboration, especially through the resources that we already have.
And I think that's the other thing that, has been something that I've been working on for a long time Erin has contributed to at least one of the collections that I put together, is the idea of talking about teaching. And, I was hearing the European president of Google talking on the news last night about the fact that all of this online work has accelerated everyone's interaction and discussion of these issues in a way that would never have happened if it hadn't been for the pandemic. Not that I'm pleased that it was here, but it has caused a conversation to happen. I'm just going to Brooke's question about liveness. Do you think that all of this digital stuff is taking away from the liveness? Personally, I think that it's inspired different types of liveness, like what we're having right now, and having different time zones and gathering together a group of people that it would have been very hard to assemble any other way. But do you think, and I live in Stratford-upon-Avon, and it's a town which is entirely dependent on the live theatre. So there are definite real disadvantages to the fact that we can't do everything live. But do you see some positives to the way that, I guess, the question is, what about liveness? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I would agree with you, Christy, that there are different kinds of liveness, and the way that we use the word live now is not the way that it's always been used. So it's sort of we're finding different ways of understanding that term. For me, it often means really strong forms of connection that we've traditionally thought of as emerging from being in the same time and place as other people, but we've loosened that link to place through things like live broadcasts of theater, but also live broadcasts on radio. And we're starting to explore in challenging ways how we might feel like something is alive and connected with us, even when time and place are both uprooted. But I think actually one thing that's a huge opportunity specifically for people teaching theater right now is the fact that the theater itself is grappling so much with this question, because there's a huge proliferation of online performance, and a lot of it is free. Henry linked to one example. There's lots of different kinds of experimental Zoom productions that are going on. Shakespeare, especially because Shakespeare is a free text for people to use. So I'll put a couple links in the chat, so that I think we might be able to turn this question back to our students, give them examples of different kinds of performances that are happening online in real time live, but then you can also watch after the fact and maybe ask them to try doing it both ways and seeing if they feel differently depending on the kind of liveness they're experiencing.
Well, as you say, I think that there's an increase in theater companies are asking, what does theater mean? What is it about? But they're also asking for more input from their audiences than they have in a very long time. And so it's not a kind of top-down, if we're thinking about hierarchies. The RSE is genuinely asking, how do we get to audiences now today, and having that kind of input into something, even like today's, to be able to talk to people while they're creating, as opposed to just responding to the end result, is an entirely, it's like the flipped classroom. It's the flipped creative environment. Sorry, Amy, did you have anything to add to that?
No, mostly just to echo the point of exploring liveness as a concept, and doing that through a digital medium is actually a very engaging way to do it, because you are experiencing liveness as we're coming to define it, which is a much broader definition. And actually, again, using platforms like DT Plus and National Theatre Live, any sort of broadcast, live streamed production necessarily, I think, facilitates that type of conversation about what aspect of liveness, or what are the aspects of liveness that are being valued in its production here, and how can you tell? So there's a lot of ways to get into talking about how theater is being made, even or especially through this sort of doubled context of being live streamed.
Yeah, and again, as I say, the plays are actually not only are copyright free, but they're so interested in the idea of communication and theatricality and what theater means and what the place of art in society, that all of that feeds into it. I'd like to bring Talia back in, if I could, so that she can talk to us a little bit about what else is coming up in the rest of this series of live and interactive, hopefully, webinars. So over to you, Talia, if you're ready to.
Well, we haven't got any specific plans about any imminent webinars, but we do have one on applied theatre that we've started to kind of begin to think about. I'm not sure whether that will be this side of Christmas or whether it'll be in the new year, but I'm really interested in exploring that possibility. Yeah.
And again, I think the fact that Beatrice was pointing out that the ASA is going to be a hybrid conference, I think increasingly those of us who have spent our time flying around the world to be interactive have now realized that, in fact, it is possible to have hybrid opportunities where you're speaking with colleagues, but also to a wider audience, which is something that I think academic colleagues have need to do more of, in an environment that is gives different levels of access, shall we say, to participatory conversations. So this idea of international collaborative conversations, which was the subtitle for this event, I really hope that there will be more of these sorts of things, which will include ideas and perspectives from all over. So unless there are any other questions, I think we're going to wrap up. Do let me know if you can, of course, ask questions afterwards, and we've all put our contact details in the chat box. And there is an accumulation of resources popping up there as well. So you will get a recorded version of this webinar, and I think that unless tell you anything else to say, we will sign off.
Thank you again, Christy, for putting this fantastic panel together, because the presenters were really wonderful and some fascinating connections between the different presentations. So thank you again for doing this work. And also thank you to our behind the scenes master, it's Steph Cook,
very much
who's
so.
Been working really hard to operate the slides and bring people in and out of the presenting room. It's been great.
Yeah, and again, I think we benefit as much from these events as the audience does, because I think we all work in a bit of a vacuum at the moment, and it's really nice to actually be able to connect and realize that we're all going through this together.
Thanks a lot, then.
Thanks.